Hello, everybody. My name is Stella. Welcome to episode 4 of the Mercuranians Podcast. Today is Monday, March 28th. It is 1:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. How you doing today, Cam?
I'm doing pretty good. Today we're going to be talking about the outer planets, which I'm extremely excited to talk about. But yeah, how have you been this last week, Stella?
I have been good. Venus's besiegement has been quite the experience, making some radical changes to my ninth house endeavors, but I'm not complaining because they're changes for the better and they have structure. So,
That's
what
good.
about you?
Yeah, I'm glad she's finally out of there. I mean, it's not going to be like totally over until she moves into Pisces. But I think for now it's like a little bit of a breath of fresh air that that whole debacle is over. But yeah,
Especially,
I mean, what were we gonna
sorry,
say?
I was gonna say, especially before Mars catches up and gets to Saturn.
Right. I'm not
Yeah,
looking forward to that conjunction on the 4th, but we'll just have to make it through that, I guess.
as we have so far.
Yeah. I was just gonna say though, like, what did you think about these other astro transits last week? Was there anything that like stuck out to you? Because there were a few transits that hit pretty good for me. I don't know if you have any stories.
Let's hear them. Let's hear them. I want to hear yours first.
Okay. Well, I was just gonna talk about the Mars Uranus square that happened.
Oh, yeah.
Because well, it didn't even occur to me until um after the whole thing happened, and I went back on Twitter that night and I was like, oh my god, Mars squared Uranus today. And I did a trade for a reading for an ear piercing. And like Mars, like, okay, cutting, severing, like piercing skin, and then Uranus, which is just like this quick lightning fast, like it's done, it's over. Like it was just such a I just thought that was an amazing way that kind of came through for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Wasn't that the first day Mercury was in Aries too? Did that happen on the same day or was that the
Oh
day
no,
before?
that was like 2 days ago or something now. But that
Okay.
transit happened like a week ago, I think.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Mercury just went into Aries. I'm thinking about the sun. I'm thinking
Oh,
about the
oh
sun.
yeah, well that was
Yeah, the sun,
yeah, the
not
sun was in
Mercury.
Aries back then too.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Mm.
I on that Mars Uranus square, I had dental work done.
Oh my God, right.
Yeah,
That's so
that's how
funny.
that turned out for me. Yeah.
But there wasn't any like random bleeding or anything too bad, I
No,
hope, right? With
no,
that?
nothing terrible. The weirdest thing about me with getting dental work done is that the Novocaine, like the shots they give you,
Yeah.
it has never been enough to like completely numb me. So like anytime I get dental work done and I'm not like knocked out, there's always like a degree of pain and
Oh,
discomfort that comes with it, but it's not like I'm miserable the whole time. I listened to an episode on the astrology podcast while I was,
while you
yeah,
oh my God. That's
uh-huh,
classic.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, speaking of Mars, Uranus, and Uranus in general, do you want to just jump right in?
Yeah, I'm ready to talk about them.
Absolutely. Uranus is so fun.
Um, yeah, I think Uranus is probably my that's tough to say. I was gonna say probably my favorite planet, but I think it's in a tie with Saturn. But
Well,
that connection is interesting anyway, because that's really like the gateway of where we're starting off here, right? Because this the whole outer three planets come after Saturn, which we just finished talking about last week. Um, and so now the outer three planets, which present a whole new ball game to the entire field of astrology, because, well, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the outer planets just really like took astrology by the throat and was like, look at us. Like,
Yeah.
any astrologer can not deny that, like, they have influence.
Mhm.
And whether you incorporate it into your readings or not, like, it's a relevant event. And that really kind of shook up a lot of the astrological community.
Mhm.
I feel like it also did lead to a lot of really, really profound and like beautiful opportunities for discovery, but at the same time, some like haphazard new like dignity assignments and like fights for stuff like that. It kind of just really
Right, I mean,
blew
it changes
up.
everything about how we look at the planets, right? Thinking that, okay,
Right.
there's more out there than just what we see. Like how, like, and that brings this question of like, all right, well now they're, astronomers are discovering how many thousands and thousands of asteroids now, and now, there's this question of integrating those into the chart. So this, like, from the discovery of Uranus onward, that just totally brought us into a new era of how we interact with the cosmos, because like essentially what that does, symbolically, having this kind of like activation or flipping the switch of understanding that there are invisible celestial phenomena that are being relevant to how we interpret charts, that just like opens this whole new layer of thinking about um like what's really going on and what the mechanism behind astrology is. Because even though for thousands of years they developed such a robust system for just working with like the seven planets and the moon's nodes, um this is now like it's been a blessing and a curse, because like yes, it's brought so many more options to the table and nuances into decoding the chart, but also it's like, whoa, we're so used to just the seven planets, now we have to learn how to work with all of these new bodies in the sky.
Yeah, and then with the outer planets just being invisible, that really speaks to a lot of the human experience about how much there is around us that we just cannot see. Our senses do not have the power for them.
Mhm.
And these outer planets just really speak to that, these areas and influences where you have no control and you often even might lack awareness for how they impact you natally or but and societally is a very different story. Like this is something that I feel like is spelled out clear as day by the outer planets, but they're just so like saturating.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just thinking about how this gateway into like the visible and the invisible, so these planets changing their symbolic archetype from what we see to now exploring the mechanism of what we don't see. So it's like tapping into how the outer planets work as a mechanism in astrology is like symbolic of astrology speaking about itself in a way, or acknowledging the existence or the confirmation of these spiritual or extra dimensional phenomena that's occurring all around us that we're blind to seeing. And the thing is about like Uranus in this case is we do have a glimpse of it though, because we are able to see Uranus for just like one or a couple days every year when it makes the solar opposition with the sun. So in a way, it's so Uranian in the way that it presents itself, because when we talk about Uranus, I mean, we'll explain very clearly how it's very much a revelatory, lightning flash, quick kind of beam of awareness. Like that's kind of how Uranus operates. And then thinking about how it just makes its visibility in this like lightning fast, just once a year kind of event, that gives that quick gateway into accessing these higher planetary spheres. It's so symbolic of how synchronicity works around us. Like there's that quick confirmation, and when we see like an angel number or some other kind of synchronicity occurs around us, there's that immediate like acknowledgement and recognition and like connecting with something greater that's like organizing reality around us, but then it's gone, and it's like this balance back and forth between that spark and then it being gone and invisible.
Right, right, exactly. And like numerologically, did I say that right? It went from the number 7 for the planets to the number 10. And that's so significant that it didn't go from like 7 to 8 or to 9, like to 10.
Well, over time, right? Because we had Uranus at first,
Right,
right? Discovered
right.
in 1781 by William Herschel.
Yeah, and Uranus's discovery was like half of an accident. Like, he didn't know that he was looking for Uranus. He
Mhm.
just liked to look for moving objects and like specifically like comets and meteors and stuff like that. And he liked the planets too. But when he found Uranus, it was like a half of an accident.
Yeah, I think it's funny how it's like the symbolism repeats itself, right? Like Uranus comes in surprising and unexpected ways. Like it's a rebel. Like it's not going to be discovered normally like any other planet, right? It's going to have some weird way of doing things, like the way Uranus just operates with everything.
Uh-huh. Like some astronomer in his free time just liked to look for meteors. Like this wasn't something he was working on, just had this moment.
Mhm.
And Uranus is I love the story of the phrase eureka, when you like realize something or like you finally have that moment where the dots connect in your subconscious and it like shoots to the front of your mind and you're like, oh my God, I've got it. Like that
Mhm.
is Uranus to a T. And
Yeah.
that story, outlandish. So this man, what do you know who it was?
Yeah, William Herschel.
No, 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 no. The story of Eureka. Do you know who it was who coined the
Oh, the
term?
Greek philosopher that was like in a
Yeah.
bathwater measuring the bath
Yeah.
displacement. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
He
don't,
uh-huh.
Empedocles or something. I don't know.
I can never remember his name.
But it's the
But
guy that
he
like
had
ran around like naked or something when he was. Oh, sorry.
yes, that was the story I was going to
Oh,
tell.
sorry.
Yeah, he sits in the bath, and the king gave him this project like, figure out if my jeweler is stealing my gold from my crown. And he'd been trying to figure out how to do it without damaging this crown for ages. And the king was not happy. Like, there was a lot of tension and a lot of pressure on him.
Mm,
And he sits down in the bath and he watches the water level raise, and it connects for him that he can do this for the crown. And he jumps up out of the bath butt naked, runs out of his house, and runs down the streets, screaming Eureka with his arms flailing and other things flailing. And he, and Eureka means like, I've found it.
mm.
I've found it. I
Yeah,
love
it's
that
definitely
story.
a Uranian kind of story there for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about, well, one of the many interesting things about Uranus, it was discovered while Uranus was in Gemini. So on that day, William Herschel discovered it. It's interesting because we don't have like a discovery date for any of the 7 traditional planets, but we do have a date for these outer planets, and that's obviously super relevant because then we can look at the chart, right? And there's always a billion things you can uncover within a chart. So Uranus like turned on and got activated at this degree in the 3rd decan of Gemini in like 23 or 24, I think. Um, and I think that has a lot to say about um, the Uranian energy itself. And I think we're going to do an episode because we were going to talk about their birth charts a little bit this episode, but I think we have a lot to say about it. So I think we're going to do a future episode just about the birth charts of the outer planets.
Yeah, we're definitely planning on that because there's just so much that could be said about that.
Mhm. But yeah, that'll give a lot of nuance into like after we kind of cover some more ground with like these planets here, once we talk about the chart of these outer planets, that's going to be like decoding exactly how these planets are functioning, when we see how these all the other planets are operating in their chart. But so yeah, anyway, it turned on in Gemini, which I think is speaks to the whole idea of like that transmission of information, right? Because Gemini is ruled by Mercury, and we talked a lot about how Mercury is that transmitter that just relays consciousness to physicality, or it relays information from one place to another. And Uranus is like that same kind of mercurial flow of information, but it's just like the spark that kind of it starts up that mercurial transfer of information, right?
Right. So, like, if Mercury is a circuit board, like Uranus is the actual electricity and like the
Yeah.
energy, like
Yeah,
fueling that
I love
circuit
that.
board.
Mhm. And so thinking about this connection between Uranus and Mercury, that kind of opens up a discussion of how we can equate the symbolism of the outer planets to the traditional planets. And, there's not really any kind of set in stone way about doing this, but there's definitely different ways we can hypothesize about how the archetypes are connecting here. But I think the loudest kind of way we can look at that is through, the signs that they did kind of activate on or be discovered in. So that shows us, okay, well, there's definitely a connection between Mercury and Uranus. And I have written down here like two different ways that we kind of talked about a little bit beforehand of equating them. And there's one way where we could think of the three outer planets as correlating to the inner planets of Mercury, Venus, and Mars. And this is I've seen that before. It's a kind of common equation
Mhm.
between them, I think. So then we would look at Neptune correlating with Venus and then Pluto with Mars. And then the other way that I've seen is also looking at the outer planets with the superior planets. So the superior planets are the three planets that have a longer orbit than the sun, which would be Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So then we would look at actually Mars kind of aligning with Uranus there. And then that next higher octave is going to be Jupiter, and that would go with Neptune. And then the highest one, the last one would be Saturn and Pluto. So, I mean, yeah, what do you think about some of those
I mean,
hypotheses?
I think it's very fascinating. I think it's really cool to play with. And I think that it definitely does speak to the nature of the planets. I mean, I could see both Mars and Mercury very much aligning with like Uranian
Yeah.
principles.
Hmm.
And and then Neptune with Jupiter and what was the other
Right.
one? Venus? Was
Yeah.
Venus the first one? Yeah. And so like you have and like just the nature of like you have Venus, which is already exalted in Pisces, and then Jupiter, who rules Pisces. Like, there's definitely a lot of symmetry there. And I think that, especially once you incorporate the signs, there is a lot of hypothesizing that can
Right.
go
At
on.
that point, it's like anybody's guess, right? Because even though
Right.
like they started, assigning rulership for the outer planets to the 12 signs of the zodiac, I mean, personally, I think there's definitely great symbolic connections, but I don't use them as like rulers personally. Um,
They would rule in a totally different way.
yeah,
Like, it's not going to be the same thing as like, oh, you have Mars and Cancer, like that means this in this area of life, and like, oh my gosh, your sun is in Aries, like that also means this. So
right.
it's a very different ballpark that we're playing with here. Here we go. This speaks on the transcendentalism of these outer planets and how they're invisible and just utterly like almost unfathomable when you take them just at like face value. Like,
Mhm.
imagine if like 3,000 years ago we would have gone back to the astrologers and been like, get this, there's planets that are huge, like almost as big as Jupiter and Saturn,
Mhm.
that are like chilling way out there, and you can only see one of them for a minute every year. And like some astrologers have seen Uranus, who was one of the first.
Yeah, like I know Herschel's attributed with its like official discovery, but other astronomers and astrologers have, I think, taken note of it before in history, but it is kind of officially credited to Herschel. But
Yeah, it was never recognized as a planet. It was always seen as like a meteor or a comet.
Mhm.
Some people even said that it was a star, so that just was like dim for majority of the time. But
Yeah,
yeah, um, I think that Uranus in particular is pretty arcane and can be really hard to understand. Like when somebody's having a Uranus transit, a lot of the times, like what you're gonna hear or what you're gonna say is like, you're gonna have something unexpected happening, like in this area of life. You're gonna go through these revolutionary changes, and you can't always pinpoint and articulate what exactly will be changing or happening.
right. And that's Uranus's whole thing, right? It's going to be a surprise. It's going to be something new. It's going to be something just out of left field because that's just how he works, right? And um, thinking about some of Uranus's significations, um, I think a lot of people talk initially about how, at least when we talk about the traditional planets, we go right to the deities, right? So Zeus and Jupiter, or Kronos and Saturn. And in this case, Uranus was the god of the sky, or like the starry sky. Um, so in a way, this kind of is like that level beyond Saturn, right? Because literally in the mythological hierarchy, Uranus was the father of the Titans, so the father of even Kronos. And at the same way, when we look at the planetary spheres, this all just makes perfect sense, because right after Saturn we have the sphere of the fixed stars, which would be the starry sky, Uranus. So it's making a natural progression, and this is just following how the astronomers assigned these names to the planets. And that's a whole nother little nugget for discussion of these men, or women, who discovered these objects in modern days that were not using, completely not involved with astrology at all. Somehow they were tapped into some synchronicity, right, that
Right,
produced
right.
them of or allowed them to make these names that have since been used by astrologers to correspond with their meanings. And like, do you see how this is, it just makes this whole
Right.
paradox of
No,
how
exactly. And then like William Herschel like wanted to name Uranus after like King
the King of
George.
England, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And like we would have had a planet named George. And
Right.
like everybody, all of the astrologers outside of England were like, fuck no. Like
Oh
this
yeah,
is
the
not
French were
allowed.
not gonna have that.
No. It was just completely rejected. And
Mhm.
like that has been something
Thank
with
God.
every outer planet, right? I know. George in your natal chart is in
George and Cancer.
yeah.
You have your George and trine
Um,
to Pluto. Oh.
um, guys, we have a George Pluto conjunction coming up. Everybody look out. But so what's happened with the naming of these planets is that there's this like there's always this like debacle and like debate and like people are going at each other's throats. And
Mhm.
then like the name that gets decided on, like when Uranus or Uranus was chosen, it was very widely accepted and like very quickly. People were
Right.
like,
It was just like
yeah.
that was meant to be. It just clicked right in for everyone, right?
Uh-huh. And it was the same with Neptune. And then Pluto is the one that has had like the most kind of like trouble settling
Yeah, there's
in.
been
But
more
once,
contention for sure.
yeah, but then once it was decided on, I feel like it was very widely accepted. The biggest
Mhm.
controversy today is the glyph.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the glyphs in a little bit, but at least real quick,
Yeah.
those Pluto glyphs, whoever's not using the circle with the cup and the cross, like, who are you? Using the P?
Listen, I use the PL in my notes because it's way quicker. If I'm like writing pen and paper, I'm
I'm
gonna do the
sorry. I
PL.
like to take my time. I like to draw my glyphs out. Like, I like things to be nice and organized. Look at these little glyphs here. I'm not using the PL. Sorry.
Excuse you. Excuse you. Where is my PL note?
Well, real quick, while we're talking about the glyphs, I just noticed the other day, somehow this just never occurred to me, that Pluto is basically Neptune's glyph, but instead of like, okay, so Neptune's glyph is the trident, right? Because Poseidon was the king of the ocean. He had the three-forked trident. That's really what Neptune's symbol is. And Pluto's is basically the trident, but instead of the line as the middle poker, it's just the circle in the cup.
Right. It looks to me almost like a scepter. I've always thought that
Pluto's
like
glyph?
yeah, it could kind of look like some kind of scepter
Hmm.
or like a chalice of
Yeah,
some
I think
sort.
of the chalice kind of
Mm-hmm.
symbol.
Yeah. I mean, when I say like a scepter, I imagine like a bigger like version of it with like a ball on top. I don't know, like a magical,
Oh,
like
okay. I can kind of see what you mean. Yeah.
that's just like always been the picture in my mind, like not
Mhm,
something smaller.
mhm. Well, and then we have Uranus's glyph, which in just the classical Uranian nature, I think is just doing its own thing. It's gorgeous though, don't get me
Absolutely.
wrong. That is my favorite planetary glyph.
It is
But
so just, it's so beautiful.
yeah. Although I will say some of the variations like are weird though, like if it's too bracketed.
if it's too
That's
sharp.
not my favorite. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it a little bit more discus.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, yeah, there you go. Um, what else did you want to say about Uranus maybe before we head into Neptune?
I just think it's worth mentioning that Uranus can be both like a volcano erupting, where you have like these kind of smaller rumbles and like some indication that something is at its breaking point. And
Mm,
other times it's just like a strike of lightning, just this immediate like whoosh, and then you have a raging forest fire.
mm-hmm,
So you can't really, it can be hard to like rein that in or take control of that. And what Uranus wants is flexibility.
mm,
And I think that Saturn also kind of wants some flexibility. They want the most structurally sound skyscrapers are the ones that have give to them with the wind and
right.
earthquakes. They cannot just be
Mhm.
fixed and rigid like that. And I feel like the relationship between Uranus and Saturn kind of speaks to that as well, where it's like you need to have structure, but you need to be prepared for wind gusts and you need to be able to stand to those.
Yeah, I mean that makes me think of like in Boston where I live, there's a building called the Hancock Tower, which is like the tallest. It's like all glass, and I think like in the 70s or 80s, like whole massive, like a whole floor, like 10 foot plus height. The whole building is glass, right? And the whole glass panes were falling out onto the street. Like massive pieces of glass were falling off of the building, and it's because it was like the winds were making the building like constrict and unstable, and
Mm-hmm.
the glass was falling out. And so what they did was they cleared out like on the highest levels of the building, they took out like 3 or 4 floors of office space, made it a huge multi-floor room, and put a massive pendulum at the top of the building that's swinging back and forth to hold the whole place in balance.
That
And
is so
yeah, I
cool.
just think it's interesting to think about how um well, one, like the whole, too much structure, there's going to be that resistance from that, right? Which is always Uranus, the force of rebellion, independence from a Saturnian restriction. And in a way, that's
Yeah.
kind of like that glass exploding off the building, right? And then the implementation of like the giant pendulum in the building being this like totally unexpected revolutionary way that this architect came up with to solve that problem. That's such a, kind of Uranian insight in solving that. But I don't know, that just came to my mind when you brought up the building
Right.
analogy.
Well, that's just like a beautiful story. That's like exactly what we're talking about here. And they Saturn and Uranus want you to welcome the unknown, want you to welcome something that you are not familiar with, and they
Mhm.
want you to be flexible but not weak. You
Mhm.
don't want to have this flexibility that's just going to fall apart and something that won't keep you grounded. And
Mhm.
that pendulum is that perfectly. It's flexible, but it's stable.
Mhm.
I love that. That is
Yeah.
super cool.
Yeah.
Do you want to
Um,
open us up into Neptune?
I wanted to talk about Richard Tarnas's work with Uranus because he kind of introduced this analogy of Prometheus as an alternative archetype to Uranus. And and he talks about this in his book Cosmos and Psyche, and he has another book called Prometheus, the Awakener. So I'm definitely drawing on what he's kind of related to the archetype here, but it's a really beautiful analogy that in so many ways makes a lot of more sense in many ways than Uranus, because when you think about it, the Titans revolted against their father Uranus, right? Kronos and the brothers and siblings kind of led a revolt against Uranus. So why are we attributing Uranus with being this rebellious force or independent, like trying to throw down structure, right? But when we look at the myth of Prometheus, he stole the fire or the knowledge of heaven and the gods and brought it to humans, right? And so that gave us life and it gave us knowledge. And he was punished for that because in giving the humans fire, he gave them liberation from the control of the gods. And in a way, Uranus being representative of the stars and of astrology and of the knowledge of the occult and arcane sciences, literally it's an analogy for when we tap into the knowledge of the stars, we're releasing the control that the gods or the stars or the planets have on us. And so Prometheus as an analogy for, the entire journey of kind of awakening to that, and like awakening force that Uranus or Prometheus is, I think is just goes to show in a really beautifully symbolic way what this is about, and just how Prometheus ties into that.
I agree. And then, I mean, as you know, the physical attributes of the actual planets is always something that I love.
Yeah.
And Uranus has an extreme axial tilt. It's almost on
Yeah.
its
Yeah.
side. It's one of the most ecliptic orbits within our solar system as a planet. Um,
Well, do you mean most like eccentric elliptic? Yeah, yeah.
ecliptic. Yeah.
Like, and that's just so funny
I
because
mean,
we use the word,
elliptic.
yeah, no, like we use the word eccentric to talk about what Uranian energies do to people, but like that's also a term in math to describe an ellipse with a really wide orbit. And so, Uranus is obviously really far out there, so it has a high eccentricity, but just
Mhm.
funny to,
Yeah. And then so even further is that Uranus, or I mean Prometheus, in this case Prometheus was injured and he had like capability to do beautiful things.
Mm,
And then he was chained to this mountain where a vulture ate his liver out every day for all of eternity. And then Chiron, the wounded healer, which actually intersects with Saturn and Uranus's orbit,
right.
came and took Prometheus's place. And I learned that from Demetra George. I didn't learn that one from Richard Tarnas. I'm not that far into cosmos and psyche yet, but I just thought that was such a like beautiful story. I
Right.
mean, maybe not beautiful, but like
It's always just the symbolism
so,
is always so there.
I
Like,
know it's so rich and fruitful.
yeah. Um, Now there was just a couple of other things I actually wanted to say about Uranus real quick. First of all, it has an 84-year orbit cycle, and this is just perfect because when you take 84, so 84 to go around 12 signs, well, if you remember Jupiter's orbit, Jupiter is a 12-year long orbit. So for Jupiter to go through all 12 signs, that's going to take 12 years. And well, it's going to be correspond with 1/7 of the Uranus cycle. But really, the way that it makes more sense is to think of it as for Uranus to do one cycle, Jupiter does 7. So 7 times 12 is 84. And that connection between Jupiter and Uranus is amazing because in the whole story of Prometheus Bound in the Greek tragedy, um, Prometheus is fighting against Zeus in Uranus. And there's this whole contention between how we are kind of reading about Zeus normally, who's like this great benefic character, and in this story where he's actually this really controlling force. And so that the connection between the mythology and then now literally the numeric coding within the planetary cycles is they're related. And that just it blows my mind.
Right, right. It's just it's synchronicity in ways that like we are only just scratching the surface of. And
Mhm.
that is something with the outer planets that I feel like I really needs to be emphasized is that everything we know, we have only scratched the
Right.
surface. And
Right.
there's so much more that will come as we really like delve into these planets over the next like millennia.
Yeah. And that just reminds me of another important point that I think we should emphasize at this point too. Like, you talked earlier about how we're not going to assign the rulerships like normal planets because they just don't work that way, right? So first of all, they're invisible. They're totally different. We've only had them for a couple of hundred years, not like the thousands of years we've had the traditional planets. But like they just move so slow that they rule over generations. They have a solely generational effect, and we can't really look at interpreting, our Neptune in Aquarius or your Uranus in Pisces and delineate something really specific about our character because of that. It has to relate into our generational um, impulse. What is our group of millennials or Gen Z here to do? Well, we can look at the Pluto cycles. We can look at the Neptune cycles. That's going to show us what our generational subconscious collective impulse is heading us towards.
Right, right. And when Uranus was in Aries, like the selfie came to be. Like the
I love that. Yeah.
yeah, like that
And now
was just like
Uranus in Taurus, right? So physical
right. And
values, we're
now
seeing cryptocurrency, right? Electric physical currency.
right.
No,
And
so not
on
physical currency, but physical currency becoming electronic.
right. And then like social media went from like beyond like a picture to like, oh, here is this immersive video. You can hear my voice, you can see my bedroom, like you get an idea of my personality. There's a
Mhm.
piece of me that's encapsulated and delivered. And like that's like with TikTok and stuff like that
And
too.
now Neptune in Pisces too, right? So
Yeah.
Neptune in
And
Aquarius turned on the internet, right? Because Aquarius is, or Uranus is electricity and the spark of, um, just things getting started. And then Neptune moving from Aquarius to Pisces is like, okay, the internet's a thing. Now you're going to be immersed in it, right? Because that transition from
yeah.
Aquarius to Pisces, from knowledge to like consciousness and like immersive experience, and like now thinking especially about this upcoming Jupiter Neptune conjunction, what we're seeing for how, it's sad to think about, but how many of us are on screens all day long, right? It's becoming a part of our consciousness in a way that is kind of scary to think about.
I agree. And I mean, with Meta coming out,
Right.
and then like we're gonna have Uranus into Gemini, which like we can assume is going to come with some major technological advancements.
And also
So,
the US chart has Uranus in Gemini. So the US is going to be having a Uranus return coming up because Uranus is going to Gemini in July of 2025. So that's going to be a huge revelation for how
yeah,
we communicate over the internet. Like it's going to be insane.
yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Well, and the last few Uranus returns we had the Civil
Civil
War and then
War.
World War II. Yeah, and then World War II. And like we just went through this Pluto return and like
We're still
it's
going
gonna
through
be
that
quite
Pluto
the time.
return.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know
Yeah.
what? Yeah, I feel like there's yeah, and then Pluto's gonna go retrograde too.
Mhm.
Doesn't it activate that point again?
Yeah, it's going to hit it 3 times. Oh, that
Yeah.
was something I wanted to bring up. The whole idea with the outer planets of like triple transits, because so the sun and the moon don't go retrograde, but all of the other planets do. So they're going to move forward, then they're going to start slowing down, in our appearance, right? It's just about how our planets are
Perception.
kind of orbiting each other. But from our appearance, they move forward, slow down, stop, begin to move backwards, slow down, stop, and then station direct and move forward again. But with the outer planets, because they move so slow, they're basically like barely getting ahead and tracing. I mean, Pluto especially, he's like steps forward like 2 feet, steps back like a foot and a half. It's so
Yeah.
slow. And I think, when we talk about outer planet transits to sensitive degrees in our chart, if you have a degree that an outer planet is going to be, really activating, it's going to be really amplified when, I mean, if it's a planet that you have turned on as a Time Lord, because these outer planets, they make triple transits. Most of them are going to hit the degree, retrograde, go back, hit it again, and then a third time go through. And so, the other 5 planets, sometimes, they can make a triple transit too, but most of the time, they're more or less moving direct. So there's a much less chance of having a triple transit over a sensitive degree. But with these outer planets, they're triple transiting all of the degrees, right? So that intensity is just turned up like crazy.
Right. And that also speaks to this like broader, slower, more evolutionary nature
Right.
that comes with like society
Hmm.
too, where we kind of have these like steps forward, and then there's like the older generations that are like, no, steps backwards.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just this very if you were we were talking about this earlier, but like if it the outer planet transits look like a seismograph where it's like this like
Right.
rapid like up and down and like
Hmm.
progression over time. It's
Yeah.
not just going to be this fluid like wave.
Right. And, we were talking about how Jupiter and Saturn are generational in the sense that, Saturn takes 30 years to go around, but Pluto takes like 250. Right? So when we just think about that, obviously the inner planets are going to have to do with, our personal evolution with Saturn and kind of Jupiter even too, representing, our personal transformation on the largest level. But then beyond that, when you get into Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, we're talking about how society is evolving. And that's why,
Right.
the most important factor of looking at the outer planet transits is studying these generational effects and looking at these long-term cycles. And we're going to do a whole episode going into the outer planet cycles because there's just too much to say about
Yeah.
them. But they are showing us literally the exact mechanism of how everything is being timed on global evolutionary levels on our planet without fail.
Yeah, and were you saying that it was William Herschel who, with the creator of Uranian astrology? What was your point about that with Pluto?
Oh, yeah. So Alfred Witt was
Yes.
pretty much the pioneer for a field of astrology known as Uranian astrology. And this was being developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Germany. And Witt was looking at the motion of the outer planets. And at this point, they had discovered Uranus and Neptune. Neptune turned on in, let me double check the year, 1870. Oh no, 1846. So at this point, they had Uranus and Neptune, and this guy was studying the outer planets really closely. And he was hypothesizing essentially that there should be more planets. And he was making such detailed analytical studies of how the transiting planets were being affected that he hypothesized. He triangulated the planetary energies and discovered that there should be a planet sitting there that's after Neptune. And he called it Cupido. And eventually in 1930, it was discovered and it was Pluto. But this man was observing it solely based off of the astrological premise of that there is an object there that's hitting and making angles and making midpoints, that's activating and triggering all these things. And he called it Cupido. And then the greatest part is when Pluto was discovered, the heart was on there and it was Cupid and it was still alive. And so it was like it's just amazing how that you know astrology is so much more powerful
It's
than we can
it's
even begin to understand.
it's not accidental. It is just
Right.
the language of the universe.
Hmm.
And I love it. I think we should like transition into Neptune
Yeah,
though.
I'm ready to get there too.
Yeah, you can tell that we are Uranian.
I know we had a lot to say about Mr.
Yeah.
Universe.
hmm Um, just some like broad encompassing words for Neptune. Neptune infiltrates, saturates, envelops, immerses, and consumes.
Mhm.
You can't really see Neptune, and the analogy that I use for that is typically like when you're in a pool and your head is underwater, you can't see the water. And but everything that you're looking at underneath the water, it's a little bit larger and the light diffracts differently through it.
Distorted a little bit, blurry,
Yeah, and
foggy.
sound is different.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And but it's kind of serene in a way, especially
exactly.
going from like the loud noisy pool and the splashing to like
Mhm.
under the water.
Yeah, and
And go
well,
ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, the whole analogy for Neptune with water, and specifically the experience of being underwater, right? So not breathing in air like we are used to doing, but having to hold our breath, like it's a liminal space on being underwater. It's continually flowing and changing, and we can't actually stay there long enough because we need the oxygen to live. So we can immerse ourselves into a daydream or into another reality or another state of consciousness, right? You can use substances. People get lost in drinking, people get lost in using drugs, or also using different substances to, potentially access a higher level of consciousness, with the intent of seeking that, right? So Neptune is this gateway into like a hard stop on the experience of normal consciousness and then transcending that into an experience of that there's just nothing like we're just not breathing air anymore, right? Like you're underwater, you're somewhere else. It is not, you can tell that is not, this is not regular waking consciousness anymore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
And the
it's
dream
just
world too is a whole
yeah.
another analogy for how Neptune works.
Mhm, mhm. I was just about to build into that, like,
Yeah.
dreams
Mhm.
are so Neptunian, and you a lot of the time, you can control your
Mhm.
dreams, and,
Well,
like, I
if you
don't
can
know.
build your awareness up to that, right?
Right, right, right,
Most of the time
that's
it's just illusionary, it's just blurry, foggy, it doesn't make
yeah.
sense, right? That's Mercury
Uh-huh.
and Pisces, right? We just felt what that was like when things aren't clear, when
Mm-hmm.
there's it's nothing is solid enough to be understood. But like you were saying, we can kind of take control. And that's the whole point
Right.
of Neptune empowering us to be connected
Right. And
to
so
to
the thing with Neptune is that like the what happens is that when you have your head underwater, if you try and interpret what's going on around you, if you have your friend try to talk to you underwater, I don't know if anybody played that game where you tried and figured out what they would say, it doesn't work. You
Mhm.
can't try to see the water while your head is under the water. And I think that that's what trips people up so much with Neptune in their chart, is that they try to look at it and they try to see like what this is, but it's so saturating, you can't see what it is. You can really only gauge how.
Yeah.
And sometimes another person will take a glance at Neptune in your chart and give you something so concise that like just totally speaks volumes on your natal Neptune that you didn't even realize. Like you try to sit there and like figure out where it is and what it is, and someone's just like, oh, like no, like your Neptune is this because of this.
Mhm.
Everybody I know with Neptune, excuse me, everybody I know with Neptune and Aquarius, they have at least some interest in psychology or the human psyche. Even if it's not something they're passionate about, they're fascinated by it.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say about the whole Neptune water connection, well, I mean, obviously Poseidon, right, was the king of the oceans, but also in water we float. So there's this level of being taken off the ground, right? Taken off of the earthly plane, the physical realm that is inherent to our existence. Neptune is just this switch that breaks down barriers. It breaks down our ego 3D consciousness that's stuck in understanding things in a physical or a linear way. Neptune is
Right.
non-linear. Neptune is
Try
non-physical.
try running in a pool.
Yeah,
Like
correct.
you can't go anywhere. You
Mm-hmm.
have to be well, in this case, you have to be more linear and less perpendicular and swim. You have to be parallel with the surface of the water and use
Go
your
with the
float.
flow.
Yeah, and float to your advantage. Learn how to manipulate the water so that you can propel yourself forward. You have
Mm-hmm.
to learn to move in a totally different way.
And there's also this whole moon Neptune conjunction with the waters, because the moon ruling the tides, raising and lowering, and the moon, as we talked about, being a gateway into our subconscious. Neptune is like sitting in that realm, sitting in that like area that is like a bridge in between how we normally perceive things and like this altered state of having some kind of revelatory awareness or knowledge of something within ourselves. Like the moon and and Neptune are both, they both act in a gateway to kind of allow the exploration of those deep watery layers of ourselves.
Right. And I mean, even with the void of course moon and like that feeling of just not having a pull, like not being able to pull your own tides
Mm.
is like a common thing. And like the black moon and the white moon and all of these different facets. And in our
We will talk
luminaries,
about all of those, by the way.
yeah, yeah. Yes, yes, definitely. Yeah, and the
So all the
moon
different
just
lunar phenomena,
yeah, all of the
different
different
lunar points.
lunar points and energies, they really just speak to that. And we say it in our luminaries episode too, that like the moon, what you get from the moon is really a reflection of
Right.
light a lot of the time. So you have
Mhm.
to look and see those craters and see the raw surface, the darkness that is there.
But in the other way, Neptune is like, yes, like the moon like reflects the light, but Neptune is like the pure reflection itself, like the pure illusion itself. So like the way we
Right.
get caught up in our daydreams or get, you know, way, in some altered point of view, or can get lost in a delusion, or, even it can be delusion of the ego, right? Neptune is what comes in and breaks that. It dissolves our ego, because what it does is it makes that reflection, that like reflection of um, the true light is like seen and recognized and understood. And then there's this crisis of like, well, what is this? And I know we kind of talked about that in the episode on the luminaries too, in the way that the moon kind of reflects that light. Well, Neptune itself really is the illusion, and Uranus is kind of what sparks the awareness of seeing that. And then Neptune gives this consciousness of being transcendent of the duality and us going to unity, right? And then it allows for this whole transformation process to start and it all comes from this reflection that comes out and the illusion.
Right, right. And like Neptune's illusion, or Neptune can be illusion with like an I, illusion with an A, where it's like you keep getting these like gentle like pulls that are kind of
Yeah.
alluding to some bigger picture in your life. And it's and even the fact that that's a homophone where they sound the same
Yeah,
and they
that's
mean
Neptune.
different things.
Mhm.
Like, yeah, and it's just a one letter difference.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
no.
I was just gonna say, like, so Neptune rules over all these kinds of psychic phenomena of, clairvoyance or clairaudience, clairsentience, um, having the direct consciousness to experience these things. Uranus is wanting to investigate it intellectually, but Neptune is like, whoa, like I just had a seance, right? Or I just, whatever. If you are a medium or if you are a tarot reader or if you're an astrologer, it's this liminal space in between just learning about like the occult sciences and then actually tapping into the consciousness yourself, having the realization of like, whoa, there's something here, right? And then that brings us to Pluto, which is the power of this, but we'll get there in a minute. But yeah,
And
so
oh, go ahead.
oh, there you go.
Okay. And I was just gonna say, like, these these current trends with spirituality, like, and the internet too, kind of tying back into that a little earlier,
Mhm.
is that like spirituality has spread through the internet in a million ways and in ways that it never ever has in the history of humanity, where we have just so many people being introduced to something at the same time.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of controversy around it. There are pros and cons, and nobody is not ignoring either. But the like spirituality just got like thrown into society again. Like we had this burst back into in the late 80s, early 90s, and then again now we have this cycle happening. And this like really took off once Uranus made that sextile to Neptune, or not an exact sextile, but that sign-based sextile when it moved into Taurus, and
Mhm.
it's sextiling Neptune and Pisces.
Yeah, and I mean, I was just gonna say also, I mean, when they were co-present in Aquarius from, the early 2000s pretty much through 2010-ish when Uranus went into Pisces in like the late 2000s, but that kind of early time there where on one level, it was awakening the consciousness of technology and computers and internet into humanity, but also, this whole idea of, well, now there's going to be a whole new way of exchanging occult information and the availability and the awareness and just the spread of that information being so public and so open now is totally unlike what it used to be. This was occult. Occult means hidden in Latin, it's not
Yeah,
evil language, but it was just hidden. It was for the select few, and now anyone can learn about this if they want to. And that's just Neptune and Pisces
exactly.
being like so open. It's so spreading the knowledge everywhere now.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Ah, it's insane.
Mhm.
And something else I wanted to mention just about the current relationship between Uranus and Taurus and then Neptune and Pisces is
Mhm.
we have this like recurrence of fashion trends like
Mhm.
at a rate that like we've never had before. Like Y2K making a recurrence, the two early 2000s, 20 years ago, like having gone out of style and then coming back already and being seen as like, oh, like this is unique, like this is different, stuff like that. And then like all the way back into the 70s too, where it's like we had like 40 years come and just like drop right back into today's fashion.
Mhm.
And it was like super instantaneous. And it's full of color and pattern and like really, really crazy like fashion choices. So I just think it's very fun.
Yeah, I think that could definitely be a cool research topic to like look at fashion trends through outer planet cycles.
Yeah.
It's definitely something there.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, pretty much the last thing I wanted to say about Neptune was Well, first of all, so it was discovered 1846 by a man named John Gale, and this came about the time right when there was a resurgence in interest in spiritualism. So like those mid 1800s, there was this whole revival towards, mediumship and having seances and connecting with the dead and the other side, because basically by the mid to late 1800s in the Civil War, all these people wanted to contact their loved ones who had died in the war. And so there was this whole resurgence for wanting to uncover the spiritual phenomena. And on top of that, Neptune emerged in the sign of Aquarius, right, which is the sign of the stars. So this planet, like, we talked about Uranus and Gemini's connection, Neptune is now connected to Aquarius, which, the traditional ruler is Saturn. And weirdly enough, this is more confusing, Uranus was kind of collectively in the astrological community assigned the modern rulership of Aquarius as well. So there's a little bit of debate there between, well, Neptune was actually turned on in Aquarius here, and it was actually conjoined to Saturn in it to the degree in its discovery chart, which I think is fascinating. But
I
yeah,
agree.
it was Aquarius.
That is very fascinating. I mean, the sign that they're discovered in speaks volumes to the nature of like the influence, I feel like.
Right.
But Aquarius can already be a pretty hard sign to like understand. Like some Aquarians are just like, what are you even talking about? And like other ones are like silent, you know? Like Aquarius is just a very outlandish sign. And then you have like this influence of Neptune, which
Mhm.
is also like almost indecipherable. Like you can't articulate something so powerful and so immersive. There's no point. I
Mhm.
said a little while ago that like this current astro weather, when we had this like Pisces pile up, it was like going through a lazy river. And like if you try to plant your feet down, you're just going to keep getting pulled forward. You can't really stop. So
Yeah.
you have to just like go with the flow. And that is one thing that Aquarians are great at is
Mhm.
going with the flow.
Well, really, I feel like they're
I
actually very rigid.
I feel like if an Aquarius recognizes that they are the ones who have to take charge, they are very rigid. But like if there's like other people who are like going at it, like ready to take the reins, like I think that Aquarians are like very good at being like, I'm gonna sit this one out and let the Martians fight. You know
Yeah.
what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Mhm. Yeah, it
Yeah,
always depends on the chart, but
yeah, definitely.
all right, so do you want to talk about Pluto?
Yeah, let's talk about Pluto.
Okay.
So, do you want to open us up? I've
Go
said
ahead.
the last few.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So Pluto is not the act of challenging, but it is the act of overthrowing. So,
Mm.
like we said that I said earlier that like Uranus was this like volcano, and then the explosion. Pluto is going to be the feet of ash that covers all of society and makes it unrecognizable, makes it bland and colorless.
Mhm.
And Pluto allows for a clean slate in however much of the land was taken out by that lava. And so Pluto is not just this act of, it's not just death and rebirth. It's not as cyclical as Saturn is. It's, however, just this like overthrow. It's this like immense power and the rebirth of the phoenix from the ashes itself. It's not the cycle of life that the phoenix goes through.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the words thrown around today for Pluto are like transformation and evolution, and it was assigned to the sign of Scorpio for the modern rulership. And so now, everyone talks about Scorpio and they talk about Pluto and transformation, and there's so many more layers and depth to it. And while I do think Scorpio definitely represents a point in evolution where there's like a death and a turning point, I think Pluto does feed into that a little bit because when we look at Pluto's archetype as Hades in mythology, he was the god of the underworld. And I think one of the big misconceptions here is that he wasn't necessarily an evil or bad god. He was just the god of the underworld and the god of the dead. So there's like this whole kind of dichotomy in understanding why we call it bad, why we call it negative, or why we call it evil, because the underworld is just the symbolism of our own personal unconscious and our own shadow self. So obviously we want to say that's evil, that's bad, and reject it and keep it hidden, right? And we talked a lot earlier, especially with Saturn, about facing the unconscious, right? And Pluto is the force that drives that at its heart. And while Saturn is going to be what like helps you kind of really get better about integrating it over time, when Pluto comes in, that's like direct. There's no avoiding it at any cost. Pluto is going to give you the deepest, darkest, most like visceral is the word I was looking for, connection to diving into your own personal unconscious in that way.
And the thing with Pluto is that if you look, you can look to Neptune for past life regressions and prophetic dreams, but you look to Pluto to find where you have been injured, to see where your wounds need debriefing and like just how raw it is inside. Plutonian spiritual reevaluation is painful, and it's rough, but it is so enriching and beautiful. And with mythology, Hades has like, or Hades rules like wealth in the underworld and has like piles and piles of gold and stuff like
Right.
that.
I mean, that's a whole other like little nugget with this, because the etymology in ancient Greek, Plutos is like possessions or money or wealth in a way. So Plutos, like when you want to talk about like a plutocracy or a government that's like basically corrupt, and it's being run by politicians that are controlling the economic system. There's this level of power and control and manipulation that Pluto represents, because it's not just necessarily an authority like a governor or a president. Pluto is like what this governor or president is doing behind the scenes that is corrupt, and the ways that they're trying to manipulate and lie to take power, the shadow side of authority and having control.
Right. And feel how you may about capitalism in America, but America has Pluto in Capricorn in the second house. And everything that you just said speaks to that very, very well. We have these corporations with tons and tons and tons of money, more money.
Capricorn, right? And then the second house
Oh,
is
yeah,
finances.
yes. Yeah, in the second house of finances.
Mm,
And then we just have like Capricorn as being such a powerful place.
mhm.
And you can see with all of the for a powerful place for Pluto.
Right.
Pluto has like such just immense power in
Mm,
Capricorn. And you can see as this Pluto return is going on, like all of these crises we're having with our economy, where like corporations have more money and the country has more debt
mhm,
than like any single person could ever even dream of
mhm.
touching.
And
And
Pluto entered Capricorn in like '08, right when we had the financial crisis,
exactly, exactly.
right at
And
the
so
onset of our Pluto return. It happened right away.
uh-huh. And we've had these kind of tensions just like bubbling up and bubbling up. And we had that exact conjunction, and now it's going to start separating. So we'll either see change being implemented or it's just going to keep
Mm.
being swept under the rug.
I won't bet on it, at least not right now, because I mean,
Yeah. I
look,
mean,
it's
no.
like you said, it's going to separate, but he's turning retrograde in May or April 30th.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to go back and hit this degree again in July. Station direct, he's hitting it again in December. So we're getting a triple transit, Pluto return. And it's also just interesting that it's all happening in the confines of 2022, because like we had that first hit in February. So this whole year is going to really be marked by, um, in another way, the revelation of what plutonic or Plutonian um, control of wealth that's been going on in the country that's going to be coming to light, because when you have a planetary return, it's kind of completing its first octave and what it's tried to accomplish, at least in this case, in the last 250 years that it's been going through that cycle. So there needs to be a whole shift, massive shift, right? A 250-year shift that we're going to see start coming out in the next few years for America.
Definitely.
And like Pluto returns of other countries, a lot of astrologers talked about the Pluto return of the French, right? Was the French Revolution.
Uh,
The Pluto returns that happened during the Roman empires were the overthrows of different consulates and emperors. So it's like there's the whole Plutonian theme of the control and the power and the ways that that can get manipulated and skewed for so that the few can hold all the power. That is just getting totally turned upside down right now.
right. And there's this whole just, I mean, it's a fact that money is power.
Mhm.
Whether or not you like it or recognize it in this country, money is power. It is
Yeah.
the ultimate power. And that is just the nature of Pluto in
Pluto.
America's chart,
And
especially.
I
Yeah.
mean, it just speaks
And
to the idea that Pluto in Greek means wealth.
wealth.
So
Yeah.
Pluto as power is the whole illusion of having money equals having power, or having
Right.
resources equals I can control you or I can make you do something. And that's just a part of the whole, you know, experience of, okay, so we've reached Uranus, we reached Neptune, we realize that we can transcend duality. And then after that, it's like coming back to Earth, coming back to, you've had this Neptunian experience, but that's not the end. We still have Pluto after that. You're still going to come back down into your body every day, wake up in the world, and there's going to be, bad things happening. It's not all rainbows and light. And Pluto is like, okay, the slowest planet, the longest journey towards a perfection in some way. And so it's the long haul of trudging through all of the really difficult aspects of life that are not included in, this ideal Neptunian vision of things.
Right. And like, I just picture like a person plummeting down through the sky through Uranus's territory and then falling into the ocean and being in Neptune's territory and then going even further into the
Mhm.
underworld. And as you go under the earth, you just have this like immense pressure and heat, and
Mhm.
your ears are popping and you feel like your head's going to explode. And like, that's what Pluto can do to you, is it just puts you under so much pressure.
Right. I think what's another interesting idea is the relation of like the Earth's core to like the magnetic field that's generated around the planet, because the magnetic field is what's keeping us protected from the sun's rays. Because if we didn't have the magnetic field, the solar rays would not be diverted around the Earth's atmosphere and we would be burnt up. This magnetic field is like diverting the intensity of the solar rays to keep us alive and to keep things balanced. So like there's this Plutonian core at the heart of our Earth in the underworld that is kind of allowing um, for us not to be so overwhelmed by the light. And so we have to have the darkness, we have to have the Pluto, we have to have the difficult and um, the darker sides of the experience to hold us back from not just having it be a cakewalk, right? Because life is hard, and Pluto is just symbolic of that in all these different ways that we're talking about.
Right, right. And then like the nuclear bomb, wasn't
Yeah, a
that
great, yeah,
yeah, plutonium core. That was what was, and like
right,
uranium,
right,
like
yeah.
both of those elements,
Yeah, I mean, you
which
could
were
definitely talk about how scientifically what some of the correspondence is there. But I mean, yeah, Pluto was discovered in 1930. So first of all, I mean, that was the onset of the Great Depression for America, right? And
Mhm.
when we want to talk about wealth and money and Pluto control, like hello, it turned on right as the US went into basically one of its worst eras in its present day history. And it was discovered in Cancer, which I think is so interesting, because when we think about what happened to America's family. And when we talk about Cancer, we'll talk about how its archetype is symbolic of the home and the family unit. Pluto being discovered in Cancer at the onset of the Great Depression, if that doesn't symbolize like the most um, just
Well,
upturned, what were you going to say?
Right. And well, it opposes the natal Pluto. Like while Pluto transits through Capricorn, I mean, not natal,
The
the
US
electional
Pluto.
Pluto. Yeah. And, huh?
The US Pluto?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. The US Pluto. Well,
Yeah,
it's,
our Pluto opposition was basically the Great Depression.
right. And you have like families and like people are going out and getting so drunk and like abusing their families and like causing problems. And that was where the prohibition ended up being put in place. And then it was lifted right at the beginning of the 1930s.
Mhm.
And so it's like people are hungry, they're poor, they're drunk, and like the government, this was one of the like most proactive steps that the government has ever taken to like get families out of poverty and make sure that people were being fed and trying to find people jobs and work. And
Mhm.
like today that doesn't happen. The closest thing we've had to that was 2008. And it's just Pluto.
When we think about Pluto in Cancer, like we can, yeah, use this word of like transformation as part of how we understand Pluto's archetype. But, as he's transiting signs, Pluto in Cancer, that's going to be, a massive shift into and transformation into the home and family dynamic. And then particularly for America, this wasn't just the Pluto opposition of America's birth in 1776, right? So Pluto had done one half cycle from Capricorn to Cancer, that's halfway. But in addition to 1930, when Pluto got turned on, right, in Cancer, that was when it was discovered. So that just amplifies even more the whole societal change that was going on, in the US, but also on a massively collective scale around this time in the world.
Right, right. And so like in the US specifically, like just kind of building off of that, we have Pluto in Cancer and then we end up going into World War One and men need to go fight in wars, women still need to make money for the families and they need to contribute. So women start working and women are welcomed into the workforce and they can start making money. And Pluto and Venus relationships have a lot to do with women's rights and women's movements. And we saw a little bit of that earlier with a Pluto Venus conjunction and then the abortion laws being enacted in Texas and basically going against Roe v.
Oh, yes, you're
Wade.
talking about the past Venus retrograde this winter.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
this last winter. Yeah. And so, like with Pluto and Cancer too, that just it really speaks to this like attitude of like not of nurturing and how that kind of really shifted.
Mhm.
And then you had the boomers, and there have been whole studies that have been done on
They were Pluto
boomer.
Leo
Right. Well, but they were raised by
by
Pluto
Pluto Cancer.
Cancer.
But then
And
Pluto Virgo came along, and that was women's rights, social rights, right? The domestic life changing, woman going to work. And I
right.
know, I know we're gonna have a lot to say about all the outer planet transits in particular, but this is just a quick scope into looking at how quickly and
Uh-huh.
succinctly the
And
archetypes lined right up with what was going on.
right. And it's like triggered here, and then it carries down into all of these subsequent signs. And
Mhm.
it's the same theme that, and as
Yeah.
of course, that's how all of astrology is. But like with Pluto, it's just this like evolution
Mhm.
and this like massive evolution with like key turning points.
Mhm.
And we right now, congratulations everybody, we're all living through another one of those key turning points.
Mhm. Yeah. And just really quickly, because we'll get into it in depth later, but the Saturn Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, and Jupiter was there too, right? Literally, there was a Saturn Pluto conjunction in January 2020 that initiated the pandemic. In 1348, there was a Saturn Pluto conjunction that initiated the Black Plague. And literally at the same time, there was a Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. And we talked in the last episode about how the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions initiate 20-year periods. And literally in 1345, there was a Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. And then just a few years later, the Pluto Saturn conjunction that started the Black Plague. In 2020, we had the Saturn Pluto conjunction in Capricorn again, and then a Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius again. And we saw COVID begin. And that's just the tiniest
It's
sliver. We could talk about this for hours, but
yeah,
it's
like go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, it's appalling to look at how these events start to correlate.
It really added such a profound layer to mundane astrology
Mm-hmm.
that like yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like we're not just seeing these things on a societal level. It's not like you're just going to go through like two of these shifts or maybe three in your lifetime with like Jupiter and Saturn. It's like this is going to be something that like you probably aren't even going to be aware of. And
Yeah.
like this is going to be something that historians can recognize.
And so this is the beauty of the outer planets, though, because when these centers are activated through our conscious awareness of being able to measure them and then subsequently measure the astrological influence, what's happening is as our astrology grows, these centers are getting activated in human consciousness throughout the collective. So as we're discovering these outer planets, we're also discovering the whole world that's around us. So like when you said this changes mundane astrology forever, yeah, Abu Mashar didn't have Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, but they weren't looking at global cycles like that. They were looking at, I mean, they were looking pretty big. They were looking at as much as they could observe through the Middle East and Europe and North Africa and into the Eastern and India. But
It's
now,
not like today.
right, it's not like today. Now there's just an intrinsic worldwide connection that we have. And, in a lot of ways, Uranus beginning the whole technological revolution and how the internet is what is bringing the world together, that consciousness of Uranus turning on and the switch to electricity and how that has changed how we connect as a society with the entire world around us, that will never be what it was like to before we had begun to discover the outer planets.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that was quite a discussion, and that was still only just barely scratching the surface of what the outer planets have to offer. But I think we did them enough justice for our hour-long plus
Give or
conversation on,
take.
yeah, Uranus and Neptune and Pluto. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, stay tuned for future episodes concerning outer planet cycles. We're thinking about doing an episode kind of playing with dignity and seeing kind of some of these associations and
mhm.
synchronicity between the different outer planets and the traditional astrology practices.
Right. I'm looking at the
So,
birth charts of the outer three planets. Like, for instance, they all have Scorpio moons. Like that's just another
like,
amazing gateway into discussion about how these planets work. um
right.
and it's so deliberate, right? Like it's just synchronicity at its
Hmm.
finest. So we definitely have a lot more to talk about with the outer planets, because I think we want to get into them a little bit and kind of finish them up, because for a while we're going to be getting into a lot of stuff with traditional astrology. So we might be saying goodbye to them for a little while. So we'll probably record a few more episodes and release them in the next few weeks, um, with some of the awesome stuff we were just talking about. So yeah, stay
Yeah.
tuned. And I'm not sure if we're decided yet on what's not happening next week, but yeah, it's going to be a surprise. It will be nice and Uranian. So stay tuned
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. Stay tuned for future episodes, always coming from us at
Yeah.
some point in time.
Yes, at some point.
Yeah.
Well, next Wednesday.
Yeah. Next Wednesday.
Yeah.
All right. Well, happy
Yeah. Happy
stargazing.
stargazing, guys, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Mercuranians
Mercuranians
out.
out.